heart for the church. And if you could just state a message to a lot of leaders, a lot of people who work in the church about the mission of the church, and one thing you would love for them to remember about the mission of the church, what would be the thing you would say?
I think that when I think about the church, and I think about, we talk so much about the crisis in the church, and what people tend to talk about is attendance.
Wow.
That the crisis is that there are less people going to church this year than there was last year, or 5 years ago, or 10 years ago, and it's not a good thing. But I don't think it's the crisis.
Right.
I think the real crisis is actually not a crisis of attendance, but a crisis of transformation.
That's great.
And that people are actually still going to church, but they're not changing, right? They're not becoming more like the person of Jesus Christ.
That's good.
And so for me, I think the challenge is not, how can we get people to show up at church? We've never really had a problem with that at Crosspoint. Our greatest challenge is, how do we bring about transformation? What does this look like? How do we create these pathways where people can transform and become more like Jesus? We really believe that this is just a fundamental expectation of the New Testament, that we would progressively grow in Christ likeness.
That's good.
Kids, students, adults. And so what does this look like, and how do we create these pathways? And so I think when we think about the mission of the church, that's one of the most important things we can remember, is that I think that's the real crisis.
And when we think about spiritual growth and transformation, and I know a lot of the leaders that are here are like a lot of the leaders in your church. They work with children and preschool and students. So, because I know this is intuitive in you, because I've been around enough of the people who work with you and work for you, that you have a real heart to see spiritual growth happen. So if we were to hand you 7th or 8th, 9th grade boys, and you've got them for 4 years, and you could do anything you wanted to do with them, and we're not talking curriculum or resources or anybody's stuff, we're talking, this is you, Pete Wilson, 7th or 8th, 9th grade boys, you got 4 years before they walk away, what do you do?
Well, first of all, I would ask you, what did I do wrong in my life that you would do that to me? No, I'm just kidding. Because I know you guys love teenagers. And I do too.
Yeah.
I think, I think a lot about this because I have 3 boys. And,
how old are your boys?
They're 10, 7, and 5.
Good.
And they're a challenge, I mean, they really are. I love my boys, but parenting
Are they
is
more like you than your wife, or what is that about?
I would say yes. They are much more
gotcha.
like me. I would like to blame some of this on her, but it's mostly me.
It's your DNA.
Yes,
okay,
it
in
is.
them.
Yeah.
Just making sure I clarify that.
And so I think about this a lot. This idea, like, what am I doing to really instill and invest in them? And one of the things, I was telling this story on Sunday, actually. We recently took our kids to the amusement park. There's this amusement park up in Indiana called Holiday World. Has anybody ever been there? Oh, really? You guys are from there, or from that area, clearly. I think it's a really silly name for an amusement park. It works. I mean, the place is packed out, right? And there is a roller coaster there called the Raven, which is like a big wooden roller coaster. And my 10-year-old had never really been on roller coasters before. And so I manipulated him into going on this roller coaster with me. And
he had
hated
no
it.
idea.
He hated it. But I'm really good at manipulation. So I talked him into it a second time. He liked it a little bit more. Third time, he liked it even more. And then we went and did some other stuff. We came back at the end of the day, and I was like, we're going to ride it one more time, except for this time I got a special treat for you. We're going to ride on the front seat. And so we get into the front seat of this roller coaster, and I'm like, oh, one more thing, buddy. The deal is when you sit in the front seat, you have to have your hands up the entire time. And he's like, really, Dad? And this is the beauty of having small kids, is you can lie and manipulate to them. Right, yeah. So
it'll fall apart if you don't raise your
totally.
hands.
I was like, yes, son, absolutely.
Yeah.
You have to do this. So,
that's great.
So he, we come out of the gates and it's strong. Like, I mean, his hands are way up and all the way up the hill, and then we go over the hill, and then this becomes this, right? And then they put him back up, and we go around a curve, and they come back down. And it's like that over and over. And we got off, and I was asking him about it, and he really didn't enjoy it at all. And I said, what, like, why didn't you like that? He said, Dad, I didn't like having my hands up because, and this was his line, I'll never forget this. He said, I didn't feel safe. And I think about that when it comes to our spiritual life. You think about surrender. The international sign of surrender is this, right? Wherever you go in the world, this means surrender. And I think one of the most difficult things I've had to learn in my walk with Jesus is surrender. To really surrender everything that I am, everything that I have, to him. And when I think about my own boys, and I would think this about a group of teenagers that I have, I would want to help them understand that part of following Christ is this complete surrender.
That's
And
good.
it's often not going to feel safe. But I think sometimes, especially with teenagers, we really sell them short. And the vision that we cast for our teenagers who are trying to learn what it means to follow Christ is just show up, right? If you just come to church every weekend or every Wednesday, like you're already way up here, right?
Right.
And I don't feel like we really lay out enough expectations from them.
That's good.
And so I think calling them to complete surrender and helping them begin to understand that if they surrender their life to the vision that Jesus has for them, they can really become the young men that God's created them to become. They can become the young women God's created them to become. And so I would call them to complete surrender.
That's really good. That's really good. So, did your other boys ride the roller coaster
No,
too?
they weren't tall enough.
They weren't tall
But I
enough?
will manipulate them into it as soon as they're tall enough.
I know that along the way in ministry, we all do have these game-changing moments where we either see something we haven't seen, we understand an aspect of ministry, and it takes us to a different place and how we do what we do. If I were to ask you what some game changers in your ministry have been in your life, what would they be?
I think one of the biggest is, and this has been a huge, we don't have enough time to cover this entire
No, we
journey.
got time.
But,
Nobody's going anywhere. They're spending the night here tonight. We're good.
Oh,
Go
great.
ahead.
All right.
No
Well,
problem.
let's just turn this into
Yeah,
a
okay.
counseling
That's
session
okay.
then.
Good. It'll be therapeutic.
I think that one of the things I've really learned over the past couple of years is, and I never did this intentionally, but I spent the first half of my ministry trying to be loved. And the whole story that you just told a few minutes ago about you and Andy in the beginning in North Point, you guys got it right. You really did. But I'm not as spiritual as Andy Stanley. and I screwed it up.
Yeah.
And I really did. I spent the first 5, 6, 7 years of my ministry trying to fulfill this desire to be loved. I am an off-the-charts people pleaser. And this was a real area of sin for me because I spent, especially I think back, when you're starting a ministry, you're starting a church, every individual is like key. Like, that's a warm body, right? They are breathing. You need them, right?
And if they give money,
Yes.
it's even more important.
Yeah, you need them to give. You need them to volunteer. And then you add on top of that you have this desire to want to be loved by them, and you're feeding your ego off of that. It's a very dangerous, toxic combination. And I look back in the first several years of my ministry, I spent a lot of time just flat out lying to people. I mean, people would come to me with ideas, like, hey, we have this dream for women's ministry. And they'd be telling the vision of what they wanted to do with women's ministry. And the whole time I'm thinking in the back of my head, we are never going to do that, right? We're never going to do that. But I'm just nodding my head like, yeah, wow, well, we'll see. You never know what God might do. And all these things, I learned to manipulate people, to tell them what they wanted to hear.
Right.
You see this trend of manipulation in my life. But I really learned to do that. And it became this kind of toxic thing for me. And I thought, here's how I justified it. I thought I was being loving. And it turned out I just wanted to be loved. And so one of the big game changers for me in ministry is being able to identify the difference between being loving and trying to be loved.
That's great.
And I think for me, when our church went to multi-site, this really became apparent because all of a sudden we have all these different campus pastors that I had to equip to be the pastor. And so now it was their responsibility to kind of fly in and be Superman. And so they got to do the baptisms, and they got to run into the midst of the crisis counseling situation. And I had to kind of watch that happen. And I'll never forget, we were doing a baptism service. That video reminded me of this. And our Nashville campus pastor, where I served most of the time, was doing these baptisms. And at Cross Point, it's a big deal, and people are going nuts, and they're high-fiving and hugging each other. And I'm watching all this take place with Blake. And my responsibility that Sunday was holding the cue cards so that he could see the name of the next person that was going to get into the tub and hug him and high-five him. And there was something inside of my spirit that said, you know what, Pete, what are you doing? You should be in there baptizing these people. That should be you that they're hugging. It should be you that they're high-fiving. And I walked away that day, and I knew that was a really dark part of my heart, that I had to sit down with that group of campus pastors and confess that and say, guys, this is wrong. All this comes from my desire to want to be loved. And I think that, the more that we get to a place where we can be open and honest about these different things, these different just demons that we all wrestle with in ministry, and drag those things out into the light, it can be a huge game changer. And God's really done a lot in my heart and helped me really be able to discern in my life and in my ministry when I'm trying to be loved versus when I'm actually trying to be loving. And you got to figure that out.
That's amazing. That's really good. Don't you think we're called as leaders to push other leaders into the spotlight?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And if you can't do it, you will never fulfill the vision God has for you in ministry.
I even think, and I know this wasn't on our questions, I even think there's a new model for children's ministers and student ministers. It's not about them building it around a personality, but about them building it around a team of people and multiple leaders and recruiting leaders that they can keep pushing into the spotlight, so it's a healthier ministry in the long term.
Absolutely. And we see that with Jesus. I mean, who did it better than Jesus? I mean, in the way that he equipped other people. And he took a group of people that I think at times probably drove him crazy, at times embarrassed him by the things that they did and they said, but he found a way to equip them and release them into ministry. And the world changed